Okay, I'm going to begin. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Ahlan wa sahlan. It's been a while since we had our last lesson, so I might do a little bit of a recap for my benefit, of course, but build on that, inshallah ta'ala. So, if you remember, we looked at simple propositions. And one of the examples that we looked at was this example of snow is white, not Snow White, but snow is white. Now, we talked about that there are two types of propositions. There's a simple one, which is called a qadiyya hamliya. That's on your left-hand side here. That's the simple type, nothing difficult. I'm going to use a different color pen just to kind of show that for you. So maybe use a green one. This one here. So that's a simple proposition. We call that a qadiyya hamliya. That's the one we're going to really focus on for the next few weeks. And the second type is the complex proposition, which is the qadiyya shartiyya. This is more complex. We will build on that after we finish with the simple one, insha'Allah ta'ala. So the simple proposition is a kind of proposition that's probably used in almost all examples that we've been covering so far on this course. It's a simple propositional statement which affirms or negates a predication. Remember, the predication is a nisba or a hukam to a predicate or to a subject, what's called a mahmul, a predicate, or a subject called mawdu. Now, simple propositions we talked about in English language typically consist of three terms. You have, number one, the subject. So that's here in our example, snow is white. What are we talking about? We're talking about snow. And then you have the predicate. That's almost like what are we describing as? And that's white. So snow, white. Snow is white. And then you have something that connects them. That's called a rabit in Arabic. In English, we call it a copula. And they usually appear between a predicate and the subject. So snow is white. Snow is the subject, what you're talking about. You know this through Arabic grammar already. Is going to be the rabit, and white is the predicate, how we are describing the snow. So snow is white, snow is subject, white is the predicate, and the copula, the rabit is the copula is here. So what does a copula actually do? The copula, it signifies a predicative relationship. It's signifying a relationship to the subject or between the subject and the predicate. And we usually call this predication. We call this predication, my beloved friend. That's what we call it. Okay. So a simple proposition, of course, either affirms this predication, i.e., snow is white, or it's not. If it's affirming it, we call it a qadiyya mujaba. Mujaba is a affirmative one. Jawab is affirming something. And if it's a negative or negating a predication, we say, for example, if we say snow is not black, yeah, in this case we call it a qadiyya saliba, which means that we're negating something. So this is very, very important. Now, I mentioned in the last lesson as well that in Arabic we don't have a copula. So when we say, for example, Zaid is standing, we have is here in English rather, but in Arabic we don't have that. We just have Zaidun qa'imun. Zaid is standing. So just be aware of that when it comes to the Arabic language and the English language. That's enough in terms of that, what you need to know. Right. So let's get that back into what we were covering. So Zaid is standing. Now, usually what we say is Zaidun huwa qa'imun. So we don't write it, but that's what we're saying here if you wanted to insert a copula just for completeness, for your benefit. Okay. Now, the predication in simple propositions. We covered this last lesson, but I'll just run through it again for your benefit. Not in too much detail, but maybe just expand on it a little bit. Let me get a red one. So The predication of simple propositions is what we call an ordinary predication. This is what we normally do. And the meaning that it signifies is that the subject is an instance of that predicate. So when we say Zaid is a human, or we say snow is white, we're giving a predication, we're giving an instance of it. So let's go back to example. When we say Zaid is human, what we're really saying is the person Zaid is an instance of human. Remember, human is a universal concept. Human is a universal concept. We talked about this in early lessons. So Zaid is a particular instance of a universal concept, which is human. Now, human doesn't exist in the extramental reality. It doesn't exist in the world out there. It's a universal that we use. This is why this little diagram can be useful for all of us. So what we're saying is Zaid, this is Zaid, he is a instance of the concept of a human. Yes, these are all available on our website. If you go to our website, you'll be able to access our course. So Zaid is a particular instance of a universal concept, what we call human. Now, this is like a loose way of saying it. What we're really saying, and I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail, a bit more precise here for your benefit. What we're actually saying, my beloved friends, is that the person or instance of Zaid, we'll stick with our friend Zaid here, has been referred to or denoted by the concept of Zaid in the mind of the speaker, which is signified by the expression Zaid. Because when I say Zaid, I'm talking about someone that's in my mind, and I've said it on my tongue. And this instance, this person I've said Zaid, he is he can be co-referred to by the universal concept of human in the mind of my speaker. That's what it really is saying. Okay, so when we say Zaid is a human, what we're really saying, if you like, is Zaid is an instance of the universal concept of a human. We don't say that, obviously, but that's what we mean when we're expressing what's in our mind in logical terms, if that's okay. Right. Let's get to the subject concept. So subject, remember, my friends, when we say Zaid is human, we're talking about the subject. When we say, so we're talking about Zaid here. When we say snow is white, of course, we are talking about snow. Now, there's just some basic things which I'm not going to go into in too much detail, but to share with you. The subject concept of a simple proposition is either a singular concept, this one here, or a universal concept. And then we get into more and more details. But if it's a universal concept, then it's referent. The thing that we're referring to is either the concept itself or the instances of the concept. Now, for all intents and purposes, simple propositions can be divided from the perspective of their subjects into three kinds. Now, there's three here, but we're not really going to be focusing on the first. There's a reason for it, but that will come in more advanced lessons where we, or modules, where we explore why we do that. The one that we're really interested in when it comes to subject concepts is what we call instance propositions. They are this one here. What is an instance proposition? It's probably easy just to think about the word itself. It's an instance of that proposition. So when I say every human is wise, the purpose of the subject concept, human, because I'm talking about human beings here, of course, is to refer to its instances. In other words, every instance of a human being is understood by this idea of wisdom. Thus, the proposition conveys that all these different people, Zaid, Sumaya, Yasin, Zubaydah, all of them, right? They are all instances of this universal concept called wisdom here, right? So they are all characterized by wisdom. That's all it is. We call this a simple proposition. That's all you need to know. Why is this really important? Well, this will be important when you're constructing arguments. when you're doing some real logic, and I'll give an example. And you can only really do them through instance propositions. So I've got an example here, which I'm going to walk you through, we can just appreciate it a little bit better. Now, logical inference depends on instance propositions, and they are the propositions that logicians are primarily concerned with. Now, the use of an instance proposition is a valid argument. In a valid argument is illustrated in this example that I have in front of me. Now, look at this minor premise. What's my minor premise? Every human is an animal. Every human is an animal. In other words, every human, Harun, Ismail, Zubaydah, they are all instances of this universal concept of humans. So you have animals, sorry. So you have animal, and every human they have animality. They are all a specific instance of a animal. Now, what is this? This is an instance proposition. So we need an instance proposition to make valid logical inferences. So that's fine. We can tick that one off. The second thing I'm going to say is every animal is an organism. So if you go above that, you have humans, animals, and organism. Every instance of the universal concept of an organism is an animal. That's perfectly valid. So that's ticked off as well. Once you have two instance propositions in the form of a minor premise and a major premise, you can come to a valid conclusion, which is, if you put them together, every human is an animal. Number two, every animal is an organism. Therefore, the conclusion will follow validly that every human is an organism, right? In the previous lesson, I actually showed this was obviously this is an example that works, so we're happy with that. But here is an example that doesn't work. When you use instance proposition, and here I've called it a concept proposition. I won't go through it today. It's one of our lessons that we've covered already before. Right, let's move on. I don't think we have too many conversations to go into in detail. All right, so what does this all mean? What do simple propositions mean? And now we're going to move from propositions, doing some logic, to bringing it into conversation with what's called existential import. Existential means to do with existence. So far, we've just been talking about universal concepts. We've been talking about simple propositions. Let's bring this into conversation with simple propositions and existential imports. I'm going to talk about that now. So there are two types of simple propositions. We mentioned this at the beginning. There are affirmative simple propositions, which have existential import. What that means, when you affirm something, it has a meaning of existence, that their truth requires that the existence of their subject reference, like the thing that you're referring to, for it to be true, that thing has to exist. For example, if I say, let's use this example here, every logician is tall, right? For that to be a simple proposition and an example of what we've been covering already, you have to have the subject, the person that we're talking about, they have to exist, right? So whether it's one or two, there has to be some logician. If there are no logicians, they cannot be told. So that's what we're saying here. It requires the existence of the subject, right? If it don't exist, then you can't affirm anything. What are you going to affirm? Nothing. And I've mentioned at the beginning that you can also have negative simple propositions, which means that you're denying someone or something. And of course, that makes sense. If you're denying something, then that thing doesn't need to exist. Yeah. So if I say here, every unicorn is not brown, so I'm denying. What I'm basically doing is I'm having a negative simple proposition. Here, the subject doesn't need to exist because I'm denying it in the first place. So every unicorn is not brown. This is true. So this proposition, every unicorn is not brown. Brown can be true if unicorns exist and none of them are brown. You need to think about that for a second. If unicorns exist or none of them are brown, or it can be true if no unicorns exist. If there are any unicorns, in other words, it's true. that there are no unique. There are in the case that unicorns are. It's not the case that unicorns are brown, right? It's just a simple idea. You think about it for a few moments, it'll make absolute sense to you, inshallah ta'ala. Simple, easy peasy, lemon squeezy. Now, it's all well and good saying things need to exist, but what do we mean when things need to exist? Because something can exist in your mind, something can exist out there, something can just be some completely theoretical. So what we do next, and I promise you, hopefully this will be the final section, we'll cover it ever so briefly, is that when we have an existential import of an affirmative simple proposition, there's going to be three types. And if you think about it for a second, you'll appreciate why. And it depends on the kind of existence that it implicitly affirms for the subject reference. So when I say every human is rational, I'm affirming something about the subject, which is here the human being, right? If I say every unicorn has a horn, I'm trying to affirm a simple proposition, an affirmative proposition to the unicorn, as an example. Okay, so what are the three? The first one is where the existential import of an extramental proposition. Extramental basically means something that exists out there. It's not mental, it's extramental. It's in addition to the mind. It's not in the mind, but it exists out there, right? Or we can call them real world propositions. This one here, hakaza, on the left-hand side. Okay, and that makes sense. And that's the most obvious one. We're usually talking about things that, of course, exist out there in the world, outside of the mind. We'll come to that in a second. The second one, which is a common one, is of a common proposition. These are like possible world propositions. We'll come to them in a moment. So it's mumkin, it's imkan. It's possible that it might exist. We haven't negated it. And the third type are built on the second one, which are called the existential import of mental propositions. And we're going to cover that as well. So there are three types. Okay. Some people call them impossible world propositions. You're trying to create. You're connecting to a subject reference which is impossible to exist. We'll come to that in a moment. So there's three types. The first one is the most obvious one. Extramental propositions, things that exist out there. Common propositions are possible ones, and we'll come to mental propositions. So let's cover the first one. The first one, it's called the extramental proposition, and in Arabic we call it qadiyya kharijiyya. Kharij means out there. Okay, and what we do is we make a predicative judgment on things, subject reference, that exists extramentally in the real world. Okay, so when we say, mathematically speaking, if you like, when we say every S is P, what we really mean is that every extramental referent of S is extramentally P. That's the mathematical way of denoting it. But let me give you an example. For example, if you write this proposition here, every human is rational. So we first need to make sure that it's an instance proposition, which it is, because every instance of a human is rational. So every universal rational idea can, every human is rational. So we're happy with that. Okay. Now, if we take this, for argument's sake, as an extramental proposition, this means that this subject here, the human, they exist extramentally, which you know, you're looking at me right now, in the real world. So every human being who exists in the world extramentally, like physically exists in the world, they are rational in the real world. That's all it means. Now, of course, human beings do exist in the real world. And since all of them are rational, this proposition is true. We're happy with that. But remember here, we're making a claim based on it being an extramental reality. Very, very important. Very, very important. Okay. Let's take a counter example. If I say every unicorn has a horn, So we first need to make sure it's an instance proposition. So every instant of a unicorn has a horn. Fine with that. We can take that as an instance proposition. Then we need to say, okay, what are we talking about? We're talking about extramental propositions. But my friends, we're talking about things that exist out there. Do unicorns exist? Right? If we take this as an extramental proposition, the first type, it means that all unicorns that exist extramentally in the real world have a horn in the real world. But unicorns don't exist in the real world. Therefore, this proposition is false. Khalas? Now, I want you to really focus here because we're going to make an important distinction. So when we're doing extramental propositions, we're making a predicate judgment, hukam, about things in the real world. That's why we also call them real world propositions, this word here, real world propositions. So the existence import of an extramental or real world proposition pertains to the real world, meaning that their subject must exist in the real world in order for the propositions to be true. Humans must exist in the real world. Unicorns don't exist in the real world, so they're false. Yeah. So they are distinguished from common propositions and mental propositions, which are the second one and the third one, because in those two, which we're going to cover now, the truth does not depend on what is the case in the extramental world, because we're not saying that their subjects either do not exist in the extramental world or need to exist in the extramental world. Very, very important. So you have to know what is the claim that you're making. If you're making an extramental claim about unicorns, right, and them having horns, they don't exist, so the argument is false. Now look at this next one that we're going to focus on. So everybody should be okay with that. I don't think there's anything difficult. It's a very sensible way of looking at this. But what are common propositions? So a common proposition in Arabic, we call it qadiyya haqiqiyya. What we do is we make a judgment, a predicative judgment, a hukam, on subject reference that could, not that are, hypothetically exist in the real world. So they're not like humans, or they're not like unicorns. What we're saying here, like in extramental proposition, that they must exist or not. Here we're saying hypothetically, is it possible that they could exist in the real world? And if they can, you're making judgments on them. Yeah. So this is why we call them common propositions, right? So mathematically speaking, when we say every S is P, what we mean is everything which, if it existed extramentally, would be S, such that if it existed, it would extramentally be P. So let me give an example. Let's stick with our example. If I say now, again, every unicorn has a horn. So here's the example. If we take this as a common proposition, not as an extramental proposition, when it's an extramental proposition, it doesn't work. We've obviously done our checking that it's an instance proposition, but when it's an extramental proposition, it doesn't work because unicorns don't exist in the real world. But what if we took it as a common proposition, i.e., that unicorns hypothetically exist? And that if it hypothetically existed, it's theoretically possible for them to exist, it would have a horn. In this world, the proposition can be true as a common proposition, not as a extramental proposition. Can you see? Beautiful, right? So you have to understand what language or what propositions you're talking about. Very, very important. These are simple propositions. So extramental propositions and common propositions will lead to different results. Okay? Now, I just want to make one point here. When we talk about hukam of common propositions, for example, we use the example of a unicorn, it's not only restricted to extramentally non-existent things like unicorn. So a unicorn is an extramental non-existent thing, right? It's a common proposition, is theoretically possible. It can even apply to extramental existent things, right? So when I say something like every human is rational, right? Rationality doesn't exist, like the idea doesn't exist out there in the real world, right? when we consider this as a common proposition, so when I say every human is rational, when we consider this as a common proposition, this applies both to those humans who exist as well as those fundamentally who do not exist but could possibly exist. Can you see? Beautiful. So this is why I've drawn it here. So it's not necessary that they have to exist, but we can say that every human is rational. That includes humans that exist right now, but those who hypothetically or will come to exist in the future. Yeah. So in other words, we have two types of common propositions. One is when you have the subject referent, they don't exist, but hypothetically could exist, like the example of a unicorn. And the second type are those reference that do exist, but can also include those who do not exist, but hypothetically could exist, like human beings. Khalas, tamam. We're okay with that, no problems. The third one, just for completeness, is what we call mental propositions. Now, the first two are the ones that you are most familiar with, extramental propositions and common propositions. And we know now, and we prove now, that they have to be instant propositions for them to be valid. What is a mental proposition? A mental proposition, what we call a qadiyya dhihniya, it's in the mind now. Whereas in the first one, it was something that exists extramentally. In the second one, something hypothetically. In the third one, we're talking about making a judgment about something that only exists in the mind. And because the thing that you're referring to only exists in the mind, the existential import of it refers only to mental existence. It doesn't have to exist out there. Okay. Now, the scholars, what they say is that you can divide it into three types. One is what's called those whose subject reference are mental concepts. In other words, they are in the mind. Then the second one is where their predicates. So this is not the subject. This is where their predicates are related to existence. So I should have wrote this is to do with subject. This is to do with predicate. Right? We know what subjects and predicates are. And the third one is those whose subject reference are posited of impossible concepts. So here we're talking about subjects again. Okay, I'll keep this brief as possible, inshallah ta'ala. So the first category is to do with mental propositions and whose subject reference are mental concepts. And the clearest example of this is the one that we've been covering forever, which is second order concepts, what we call ma'qul thanawi. For example, when you say human is a universal, right? What you're doing here is you're taking a second order concept, this idea of universality of humans, human being, universal, and you're predicating it to human, right? So what you're doing is you are taking universal, which is a mental concept, doesn't exist out there in the world. We're not really interested in hypothetically. It's something in the mind. When you think about universals, my friends, what is universal? It doesn't exist. You can't see a universal. It's a mental concept. It's in the mind. And you're then attaching it to the human being to say the human is a universal, for example. Yeah? It's a very simple one, nothing difficult. I'm not going to go into more detail alongside that. The second one is when you do a mental proposition again, but the predicate is related to existence. So this is the existence. So we're talking about the predicate now, not the subject. Now, we talked about early on, if you remember, the knowledge of what something is comes before the knowledge of that it is. So you have, if, for example, if I say iPhone, and then I say iPhone exists, before I can say iPhone exists, you need to know what an iPhone is. Can you see? It's like before you do ontology, you need epistemology. Before you do epistemology, you need ontology. You need something to exist, right? If I say pen, qalam, a pen exists. First of all, you need to know what a pen is. Otherwise, how are you going to affirm or negate it? Sounds obvious, but this is important. So another way of saying this is that existence when we talk about existence, like a qalam, a pen, right? It has essences, right? You're kind of like saying a pen has an essence, if you like, or a phone has an essence. What we're basically saying is that it has an essence. Yeah. So existence is predicated of essences. We basically conceive of an essence, a pen or a phone, and only afterwards do we investigate whether it exists or not. If it exists, we say the predicate has an essence, right? So if we say lions exist, you have to have the idea of existence. You have to have an idea of what existence means, right? Things that possess the existence of, like, essence of lions, right? And you have this in your mind. This is something that's in the mind, because existence is not something that you can touch. It's just something that's just there, exists. It just exists, right? And so then we can say, well, if we use this predicate to attach it to a subject like a lion, then we can make a judgment. Yeah. The subject of the predication is not extramentally existing things, but a mental concept. So when we say, for example, lions exist, the word exists, which is a predicate, we're making a claim about it. Lions exist basically means something that has the essence of a lion, the dhatiyya of a lion. And you can only affirm or negate it once you know what a lion is. Yeah? This is important. The third type, and I'm not going to go into more detail. The third type, this is all to do with mental concepts, yeah? Because existence is in the mind. Like in the second example here, when I say human is a universal, that's in the mind. Existence in the mind. These are all mental concepts. They're not the first type. They're not this one here, because they don't have extra mental existence, and they're not hypothetical. We're not making hypothetical claims here. We know that they exist, but they exist in the mind. Beautiful, isn't it? It's like it's just blown your mind away, literally. Forgive the pun. Yeah. Extramental existence outside of mind, theoretical existence, and things that exist just in the mind. 3 levels. And in the ones that have in the mind, there are 3 levels. We've covered the first one, which is something where it's to do with the subject. The second one is to do with the idea of the predicate, and the third one is what is of mental propositions where the predicate are related to necessary non-existence. Necessary non-existence. It's an impossible concept. Yeah, it can't exist in the real world, but so it can't be number 1, it can't be number 2, but it can exist in the mind. The concept can exist in the mind. Yeah, but it's an impossible, right? So it can't exist in the real world, whose instances can't exist in the real world, but we can have, like, we can think about it in our minds. Yeah. For example, when we say partner in God's, when I say a partner in God's divinity, a sharik, right? You can think about this. For you, like, it makes sense that there's the partnership idea makes sense to you, and you can think about the idea in your mind that there's a partner in God's divinity in your mind. We're not talking about whether it exists in reality. So we're not talking about a first type. We're not doing experimental realities, and we're not doing theoretical conversations here, which is the second type. So this is called necessary non-existence. This is like, but you can come to the conclusion, of course, that it can't happen out there. It might be in your mind, but it doesn't happen out there in the real world. Right? So the logicians mention, however, that instances of impossible concepts can be posited in the mind for the sake of predication. So when I say, Allah says in the Quran, right, that, if there were more than one gods, this would have happened, that would have happened. You can think about it. You can think about if there were 2 gods, God A and God B, and what would happen. That's in your mind. That's a mental concept, right? But it's an impossible type of concept, right? It's impossible because it can't exist in the real world, right? It doesn't exist experimentally. So these things so God having a partner is a mental existence, but not experimentally, nor in of itself. Khalas. I'll stop there. I hope you've learned a lot today, inshallah ta'ala. We'll pause there. We'll move on, inshallah ta'ala, in the next lesson. If anyone has any questions, they can ask, inshallah ta'ala. I don't know how we can do this, but if anyone has any questions, they can ask. Oh, okay. How do I move this? Anyone have any questions? No questions. We are happy. Alhamdulillah. I think this is quite straightforward. I mean, you just have to digest it, but I think it's quite straightforward. Do we have any questions? Let me just check on the other channel. No questions. Okay, we'll stop there, inshallah ta'ala, and I'll see you very, very soon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.